The laughter died like a flame doused in ice water when Earl Whitaker's weathered fingers reached for the zipper of his frayed denim jacket. The fluorescent lights of Lou's roadside diner suddenly seeming too harsh, too revealing. The men who moments before had been snickering behind greasy menus and whispering, "Lot lizard lover," fell silent as the fabric parted to reveal not the soft middle-aged spread they'd expected, but a tapestry of scars that told stories deeper than their shallow minds could fathom. No one moved in those first seconds. Not Marlene with her coffee pot frozen mid-pour, not the cook peering through the service window, not even the teenage busboy who'd been the loudest with his mockery. The jukebox switched tracks with a mechanical click that echoed through the silence. Waylon Jennings lamenting about good-hearted women, as Earl's gaze remained fixed on his untouched slice of cherry pie, his face a mask of practiced indifference. That had served him well through 3 tours in Afghanistan and 15 years hauling freight across a country that had forgotten men like him. They'd started in on him the moment he'd taken his usual corner booth, the one with the view of both the parking lot and the highway beyond, a habit formed from years of situational awareness that civilian life couldn't break. "Look at the old road dog," one had muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Bet he can't even remember what state he's in half the time." Another had chimed in about the calluses on his hands, suggesting crude things about what those hands might do during those long, lonely nights on the interstate. Earl hadn't reacted then, hadn't given them the satisfaction. He'd ordered his coffee, black and his pie heated, using as few words as possible, his voice a graveled whisper from years of cigarettes and road dust. Marlene had smiled at him with the weary kindness of a woman who'd seen too many men pass through, some decent, most not, all of them carrying burdens invisible to the casual observer. It was only when the youngest of them, a lanky kid with much product in his hair and not enough life in his eyes, had knocked deliberately against Earl's table, sloshing coffee onto the worn laminate, that something had shifted. Not in Earl's expression, which remained as impassive as the face of a mountain, but in the air around him, a subtle change in pressure that those with finer instincts could sense, like animals before a storm. "Sorry about that, Grandpa," the kid had sneered, not sorry at all. "Hands not as steady as they used to be when you're pushing 70, huh?" Earl had looked up then, truly looked at them for the first time, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky and just as cold. The booth of mock cowboys fell silent under that gaze, suddenly aware that they were in the presence of something they didn't understand, something beyond their safe, small-town experience. And that's when Earl had reached for his zipper. Earl zipped his jacket back up with the same deliberate calm with which he'd revealed his scars. He laid a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover his coffee and pie, and stood up. At 6'2", he wasn't the tallest man in the diner, but something about the way he carried himself, shoulders square and steps measured, made him seem larger. He nodded once to Marlene, a silent thanks, and walked toward the exit, boots echoing on the linoleum. "Sir, your change," Marlene called after him, but Earl just raised a hand without turning around. "Keep it," he said, voice barely audible as the door swung shut behind him. Outside, the night air was cool against his face, carrying the scent of diesel and the promise of rain. The parking lot of Lou's roadside diner was half empty, just a few local pickups, a couple of sedans, and Earl's rig a meticulously maintained Peterbilt 389, with deep blue paint that gleamed even under the weak security lights. Whitaker Transport was stenciled on the door in simple white lettering, no fancy graphics or slogans. Earl didn't believe in advertising what wasn't necessary. He climbed up into the cab with the practiced motion of a man who'd done so thousands of times, his body moving through the familiar routine while his mind wandered elsewhere. The inside of the cab was as neat as a military barracks, everything in its place, nothing extraneous. A small photo in a plain frame was affixed to the dashboard, angled so only the driver could see it. A U.S. Army mug, empty now, sat in a custom holder beside the gearshift. A road atlas, despite the GPS mounted above, lay within easy reach, its pages worn at the corners. Earl sat for a moment without starting the engine, looking out at the town of Millerville. From this vantage point in the elevated lot, he could see most of the main street, the hardware store with its faded awning, the post office with the flag already taken down for the night, the bank with its too bright ATM lights, and a half-dozen storefronts with for lease signs in their windows. Beyond, residential streets stretched into the darkness, punctuated by the yellow glow of porch lights and the blue flicker of television screens. He'd been passing through Millerville for almost a decade now, stopping at Lou's every Tuesday, when his route took him along Highway 12. It wasn't the shortest path between his usual pickup in Cincinnati and the drop-off in Tulsa, but the bypass around Lake Erie had construction that never seemed to end, and Earl preferred the quiet roads through. Towns like this one, places where time moved differently, slower, where a man could sit in silence without anyone expecting conversation. Or at least, that had been true until recently. Millerville had changed in subtle ways over the past year. More empty storefronts, fewer familiar faces at Lou's, more tension in the air, like static before a lightning strike. The town had lost its largest employer when Millerville Manufacturing closed its doors after being bought by a conglomerate that moved production overseas. 200 jobs gone overnight in a town of just under 5,000. The ripple effects had touched everything from church attendance to divorce rates to the rise in for sale signs on houses whose mortgage suddenly couldn't be paid. Earl started the engine, the diesel rumbling to life with a comforting vibration. He had a schedule to keep, 10 more hours of driving before he could rest at the yard outside Tulsa. But something made him hesitate, looking back at the diner where light spilled onto the asphalt in bright rectangles. Through the windows, he could see the group of men who'd mocked him, now huddled in conversation, occasionally glancing toward the parking lot. Marlene was wiping down his table, her movements brisk and efficient, her face a careful blank. Should pull out now, get back on the road where he belonged. But Earl Whitaker had never been one to run, not even when running would have been the sensible choice. He turned off the engine. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted. The men, 5 of them, Earl counted automatically, a habit from his military days, had moved to the counter, their voices lower, but their body language still agitated. Marlene looked up when the bell above the door jangled, surprise flashing across her face when she saw Earl return. "Forget something?" she asked, tucking a strand of graying blonde hair behind her ear. Earl shook his head. "Thought I might have that pie after all," he said, reclaiming his booth in the corner. From here, he could see the entire diner and both exits. Another old habit, the youngest of the group at the counter, the one who'd spilled. Earl's coffee turned and scowled. "Thought you'd hit the road, old man," he called, loud enough for everyone to hear. Earl ignored him, focusing instead on Marlene as she poured him a fresh cup of coffee. "Don't mind Tyler," she said quietly, setting down a new slice of pie. "His daddy owns half the town now, thinks that makes the boy entitled to run his mouth." "James's kid?" Earl asked, the rare question surprising even himself. Marlene nodded, glancing over her shoulder at the group. "James Sr. Bought up the factory land after the closure, been buying everything else he can get his hands on since. Calls it revitalization. Most folks around here call it something else, but not where he can hear." Earl had known James decades ago, before Afghanistan, before the trucking. They'd gone to the same high school, 2 counties over, had even played on the same football team for a season before James dropped out to work for his father's construction business. They hadn't been friends, exactly, but they'd been friendly enough. Strange how life circled back sometimes. "Your brother still live out on Creek Road?" Earl asked, remembering fragments of conversations over the years. Marlene had always been kind to him, one of the few people he exchanged more than the bare minimum of words with during his stops. "David? Yeah, still in our parents' old place." She lowered her voice further. "Been rough since he came back from Iraq. Lost his leg below the knee. VA benefits barely cover his medications." A tight smile. "But he's alive. Got his bad days, but don't we all?" Earl nodded, understanding more than she realized. He'd seen too many come back broken in ways that didn't always show. Some, like him, carried their wounds on the outside, where they could be seen, acknowledged. Others, like Marlene's brother, carried the invisible weight of memories that civilian life had no context for. At the counter, Tyler and his friends were getting louder, their laughter forced and sharp-edged. The oldest of the group, mid-30s, wearing a polo shirt with the logo of a real estate company, kept glancing at his watch as if he had somewhere better to be. The others seemed content to nurse their beers and keep the performance going, though their audience had dwindled to just Earl, Marlene, and the cook visible through the service window. "Sheriff Dawson should be by soon for his usual," Marlene said, nodding toward the door. "Always stops in around 11 before his final patrol." It wasn't quite a warning, but Earl understood the implication. Things could escalate, and Marlene was giving him an outer reason to finish his pie and be gone before any real trouble started. But the mention of her brother had stirred something in Earl, a memory or perhaps a sense of responsibility that he'd thought long buried. "Got a room anywhere in town?" he asked, surprising Marlene and himself with the question. "You staying over?" She couldn't quite hide her surprise. In all the years he'd been stopping at Lou's, Earl had never spent the night in Millerville. He was always just passing through, a constant in his transience. "Got some maintenance to do on the rig," he said, the lie coming easily. "Better to do it with daylight." Marlene studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the window. "Harvey's got rooms above the hardware store. Nothing fancy, but clean. Tell him I sent you." Earl nodded his thanks and returned to his pie, eating methodically while keeping one eye on Tyler's group. They'd noticed his return and the conversation with Marlene, their attention now firmly fixed on him, despite their attempts to appear casual. The tension in the diner had taken on a different quality, less mocking, more assessing, as if they were trying to figure out what kind of threat Earl might pose. By the time Sheriff Dawson arrived, sliding onto a counter stool with a tired sigh and a nod to Marlene, Earl had finished his pie and was on his second cup of coffee. The sheriff was younger than Earl had expected, maybe 40, with the weathered face of a man who spent a lot of time outdoors and the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen enough trouble to anticipate where it might come from next. "Evening, Marlene," Dawson said, then turned slightly to acknowledge Earl with a respectful nod. "Sir." Earl returned the nod, that small gesture of mutual recognition between men who understand certain things without needing words. The sheriff's gaze lingered for a moment on Earl's jacket, now fully zipped, then moved to Tyler's group, his expression cooling several degrees. "Boys," he said, his tone making the greeting sound more like a warning. The atmosphere in the diner shifted again, the younger men suddenly finding reasons to check their phones or drain their beers. Within 10 minutes, they'd paid their tabs and filed out, Tyler deliberately bumping against Earl's table again as he passed. Not hard enough to spill anything this time, but enough to make his continued disrespect clear. "Sorry about that," Sheriff Dawson said after they'd gone, moving to sit at the counter stool closest to Earl's booth. "Tyler James has been a problem since high school, and his daddy's money means he's never had to learn otherwise." "Not your fault," Earl said, his voice still graveled but softer now in the quiet diner. "Heard you might be staying over," Dawson continued, accepting a coffee from Marling. "Harvey's got good rooms. Quiet. He was military too, Marines. Respects privacy." Earl didn't ask how Dawson knew about his service. Small towns had their own information networks, and a sheriff would know how to access official records if needed. Instead, he simply nodded again and finished his coffee. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the windows and transforming the neon signs into blurred halos of color. Earl watched the empty street, thinking about Marlene's. Brother on Creek Road, about Tyler James and his father buying up the town piece by piece, and about the unexpected detour his carefully mapped life had just taken. Morning in Millerville arrived with the persistent drizzle that had started the night before, transforming the town into a watercolor painting of grays and muted blues. Earl woke at 5:30, the same time he'd risen for the past 30 years. Whether in barracks, truck stops, or as now the sparse but clean room above Harvey's Hardware, the room contained only the essentials: a single bed with a firm mattress, a dresser with 3 drawers, a small desk with a lamp, and a bathroom, barely large enough to turn around in. It suited Earl perfectly. He'd never needed much space, had learned early in life that possessions were just things to lose or leave behind. He went through his morning routine with military precision 20 push-ups, 20 sit-ups, a quick shower, a careful shave. By 6:15, he was dressed and heading downstairs, the wooden steps creaking under his weight, despite his attempt to move quietly. Harvey himself was already in the store, restocking shelves with boxes of nails and screws. He was a compact man in his 60s, with the muscular forearms of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. The USMC tattoo on his right bicep was faded, but still visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Coffee in the back," Harvey said. Without looking up, "Help yourself." Earl nodded his thanks and found his way to the small break room, where a pot of coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon was waiting. He poured a cup and returned to the front of the store, where Harvey had finished with the hardware and was now checking inventory on a clipboard. "Marling called," Harvey said, making a note on his list. "Said you might be looking for her brother." Earl raised an eyebrow. News traveled fast, though he shouldn't have been surprised. In a town this size, everything was everyone's business. "Just passing through," Earl said, but the words lacked conviction even to his own ears. Harvey snorted softly. "Sure. Creek Road's about 3 miles east. Can't miss the Place Blue house with a ramp out front. David's usually on the porch this time of morning." Earl finished his coffee in silence, then returned the mug to the break room. When he came back, Harvey was holding out a brown paper bag. "Sandwiches," he explained at Earl's questioning look. "David doesn't get out much. Doubt he's eating right." Earl accepted the bag with a nod, this unspoken understanding between them requiring no further discussion. As he turned to leave, Harvey spoke again. "Watch yourself with the James crowd. They don't take kindly to outsiders interfering in what they consider their business. And lately, everything in Millerville is their business." The rain had lightened to a fine mist by the time Earl climbed into his truck. He'd mapped out Creek Road on his phone now, narrow country lane that wound through farmland before intersecting with the state highway 10 miles east of town. It wasn't on his regular route, not by a long shot, but something about Marlene's mention of her brother had lodged in his mind, like a splinter that couldn't be ignored. The Blue house was exactly as Harvey had described, a modest single story, with peeling paint and a wooden ramp leading to the front porch where a figure sat in a wheelchair, a blanket across his lap despite the mild morning temperature. As Earl pulled his rig to the side of the narrow road, the figure straightened, one hand moving instinctively to the side of the wheelchair, where, Earl suspected, a weapon was concealed. Old habits, Earl parked and climbed down, deliberately keeping his movements slow and visible. The man on the porch, David, presumably watched him approach with the wary gaze of someone accustomed to threats from unexpected quarters. "Morning," Earl called when he was still 20 feet from the ramp. "Marlene. Sent sandwiches." He held up the paper bag as evidence. David's posture relaxed fractionally, though his eyes remained watchful. Up close, the resemblance to Marlene was evident, the same direct blue gaze, the same stubborn set to the jaw. But where time had softened Marlene's features, it had hardened David's, carving deep lines around his mouth and between his brows. "You're the trucker," David said, recognition dawning. "The one Tyler James and his cronies were giving trouble to. Marlene called this morning." Earl nodded, climbing the ramp and offering the paper bag. "Harvey sent these." David accepted the bag with a half-smile. "Harvey thinks nobody in Millerville can feed themselves but him." He gestured to the other chair on the porch. "Have a seat if you want. Coffee's inside, but I don't get around so well these days." "I'm good," Earl said, settling into the chair. From this vantage point, he could see clear across the property, a few acres of what had once been a working farm, now mostly overgrown, except for a large vegetable garden to the side of the house. Beyond that, the land sloped down to a creek lined with willows, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, two men accustomed to their own thoughts, until a black SUV with tinted windows turned into the driveway, gravel crunching under its tires. David tensed, his hand again moving to the side of his wheelchair. The SUV stopped, and the driver's door opened to reveal Tyler James, looking considerably less cocky than he had at the diner. He approached the porch slowly, glancing nervously between David and Earl. "Mr. Reynolds," Tyler said, addressing David while pointedly ignoring Earl. "My father sent me to apologize for my behavior last night. It was ... inappropriate." The words sounded rehearsed, empty of any real contrition. David's expression remained neutral, but Earl could sense the contempt radiating from him. "That right?" David said finally. "And what exactly are you apologizing for, Tyler? For harassing a stranger passing through town, or for being the kind of man who thinks that's acceptable behavior?" Tyler's face flushed. "Look, I said I'm sorry. My dad wants to make sure there's no misunderstanding between us, especially with the zoning meeting coming up next week." "Ah," David nodded slowly. "Now it makes sense. Your daddy's worried I might speak up at the meeting, tell the town council what I think about his plans for Creek Road." Tyler's gaze darted to Earl, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation in front of a witness. "My father's development will bring jobs back to Millerville. The highway frontage is not for sale," David interrupted flatly. "Not my piece, anyway. Your father's bought up half the town already. He can leave this part alone." The tension between them was palpable, laden with the weight of previous confrontations. Earl remained still, an observer in a drama that had clearly been playing out for some time before his arrival. Tyler's phone buzzed, and he checked it with evident relief. "I've got to go. My father wanted me to extend an invitation to dinner tonight to discuss ... options." His gaze flicked to Earl again. "Your sister is welcome, too." "I'll pass," David said. "But you can tell your father what I've told him before. This land belonged to my grandfather, and his father before him. It's not for sale at any price." Tyler nodded stiffly and turned to go, then hesitated, looking back at Earl. "I owe you an apology too, sir. My behavior at the diner was out of line." The words might have seemed sincere, if not for the calculating look in Tyler's eyes, assessing Earl as a potential problem to be managed, rather than a person deserving of genuine remorse. Earl simply nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology. Tyler returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the damp morning air. "So," David said after a moment, turning to Earl with a speculative gaze, "Marlin tells me you're staying in town for a while." "Truck maintenance," she said. Earl met his gaze steadily. "That's right." David's smile was knowing. Must be serious maintenance to keep a man off the road, especially a man who's been passing through for years without ever staying a night. Earl said nothing, but something. In David's words echoed his own thoughts from the night before. Why had he decided to stay? What was he hoping to accomplish in a town where he had no connections, no stake in the outcome of whatever struggle was playing out between David Reynolds and the James family? And yet, as he looked out at the creek and the willows and the small, weathered house that David Reynolds was determined to protect, Earl felt a sense of recognition, of something forgotten, now remembered. This place, this moment, held an echo of what he'd once fought for, not just in Afghanistan, but in the years before, when he'd still believed in the possibility of home. By the end of Earl's first week in Millerville, the town had recategorized him from passing through to staying a while. It was a subtle shift, marked by small changes in how people greeted him. Nods became hellos. Brief acknowledgments became actual conversations. Harvey had extended his room rental indefinitely at a reduced weekly rate. Marlene had started setting aside the corner booth for him without being asked, and his coffee appeared the moment he walked through the door of Lou's Diner. Most surprising to Earl was how quickly he'd fallen into a routine. Mornings at David's place, helping with repairs that had been neglected since David's injury, a sagging porch step, gutters clogged with leaves from the previous fall, a water heater that rumbled ominously. Afternoons spent making supply runs. In his rig, using his commercial contacts to source materials at prices the local hardware store couldn't match. Evenings at Lou's, where he'd taken to having dinner before returning to his room above the hardware store. It was during one of these dinners, a week after his impromptu decision to stay, that Earl first noticed the bulletin board near the diner's entrance. Previously cluttered with faded community announcements and business cards, it now featured a large notice printed on expensive cardstock. Public hearing Millerville Town Council proposed rezoning of Creek Road Agricultural District to Commercial Industrial. USED was set for the following Tuesday, just 4 days away. Below the official notice, someone had taped a handwritten sign that read, "Save Our Home, Speak Up." The contrast between the official document and the hastily made protest sign seemed to encapsulate the imbalance of power in the struggle over Millerville's future. James Sr. had those printed up special, Marlene said, following Earl's gaze as she refilled his coffee. Got his lawyer to draft the language so it sounds all official and inevitable. She lowered her voice. But he's nervous. Needs a unanimous council vote for the rezoning, and he's only got 4 of the 5 locked down. Earl raised an eyebrow. Who's the holdout? Margaret Whitley. Taught school here for 40 years before retiring. Her family's been in Millerville longer than the James clan. Marlene's smile held a hint of satisfaction. She's not easily intimidated, and she's got questions about environmental impacts on the creek that runs through all that land. The bell above the door jangled, and Sheriff Dawson entered, shaking rainwater from his hat. The weather had been consistently dreary since Earl's arrival, alternating between drizzle and downpour, as if the sky itself were mourning what might be lost. Dawson nodded to Earl as he passed, a gesture that had become familiar over the past week. The sheriff took his usual seat at the counter, accepting a coffee from Marlene with a tired smile. "Rough day?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Code enforcement came out to David's place this afternoon," Dawson said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Claimed they received an anonymous complaint about structural hazards. Wanted to condemn the house on the spot." Earl's hands stilled around his mug. He'd left David's around noon, headed into the next county to pick up lumber from a supplier who owed him a favor. The porch repairs they'd started that morning were incomplete, sawhorses and tools still set up when he'd departed. "David, okay?" Marlene asked, knuckles white around the coffee pot. Dawson nodded. "I was nearby when the call came in. Got there before they could post any notices. Reminded them that the county needs proper documentation and a court order before condemning an occupied residence, especially one belonging to a disabled veteran." Earl met Dawson's gaze across the diner. "They'll be back," he said, not a question but a certainty. "With paperwork next time," Dawson agreed grimly. "James isn't subtle, but he knows how to work the system. He's got people in the county offices, the bank, everywhere that matters." Earl considered this new development. The tactics were familiar. He'd seen similar strategies in other contexts, both military and civilian. Pressure applied at vulnerable points. Escalation designed to force capitulation through exhaustion rather than direct confrontation. "We need to finish those repairs," he said finally. "Not just patch jobs. Make everything up to code and beyond, so there's nothing they can use." Dawson sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "That takes money, materials, labor. David's VA benefits barely cover his medical expenses, and Marlene," he stopped, glancing apologetically at her. "And I'm working double shifts just to keep my own place," Marlene finished for him. No self-pity in her voice, just pragmatic acknowledgement of reality. Earl thought about the contacts he'd accumulated over 15 years of cross-country hauling the builders who owed him for delivering materials during blizzards when no one else would drive, the suppliers who gave him preferential rates for his reliability, the network of fellow truckers who understood the code of the road. You help when you can, because someday you'll be the one needing help. "I might know some people," he said, the understatement deliberate. Earl had never been one to oversell or overpromise. "Let me make some calls." The next morning dawned clear for the first time in days, the sun breaking through clouds to illuminate a Millerville that seemed subtly transformed by the light. Earl was at David's by 7, a thermos of Harvey's industrial-strength coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, already deep in conversation with a contractor from Oklahoma who specialized in accessibility modifications for disabled veterans. David watched from his porch as Earl paced the yard, his conversation a mix of technical specifications and gentle arm twisting. "Mike, you remember that time in Albuquerque when you had that deadline and no driver willing to take the mountain route in a snowstorm?" "Yeah, that was me. I'm calling in that marker." By noon, Earl had secured commitments for donated materials, discounted professional services, and the promise of labor from a veterans group 2 counties over. The operation was taking shape in his mind with the same strategic clarity that had once guided his military planning. Resources identified, logistics coordinated, contingencies accounted for. David watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and wariness. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally, when Earl paused between calls. "You don't know me. Don't owe me anything." Earl considered the question, looking out over the property that 3 generations of Reynolds men had worked. "Maybe I'm tired of just passing through," he said finally, surprising himself with the admission. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a white pickup truck with the logo of the county building department on its door. 2 men in khaki uniforms emerged, one carrying a clipboard, the other digital camera. They approached the house with the confident stride of men accustomed to wielding bureaucratic authority. "Mr. Reynolds," the older inspector began, consulting his clipboard, "we're here for a follow-up inspection regarding multiple code violations identified yesterday." Earl stepped forward, positioning himself between the inspectors and the porch where David sat. "You have documentation?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made both men hesitate. The inspector with the clipboard frowned. "Sir, this is official county business. If you're interfering—" "Not interfering," Earl said. "Just asking to see the official. Notice of violations, as required by County Ordinance 14B, before any follow-up inspection can be conducted." The inspectors exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this knowledge of procedural details. "We have a verbal authorization from the department head," the younger one offered, less certain now. Earl shook his head. "Not sufficient under state law for properties owned by disabled veterans. You need written documentation, filed with both the county clerk and the VA office." He pulled out his phone. "I can call Sheriff Dawson to confirm if you'd like." The mention of Dawson seemed to deflate their official posture. After a brief, whispered consultation, they retreated to their truck with assurances they would return with the proper paperwork. As they drove away, David let out a low whistle. "Where'd you learn all that legal mumbo-jumbo?" "Called a lawyer. Friend this morning," Earl admitted. "Specializes in veterans' housing rights. He walked me through what they can and can't do." David studied Earl with new appreciation. "You're not just a trucker, are you?" Earl shrugged. "Was a sergeant, 10th Mountain Division. 3 tours in Afghanistan." He didn't elaborate, didn't need. 2. David would understand what wasn't said about leadership, about responsibility for those under your command, about the habits of mind that never quite left even after the uniform did. "Well, Sergeant," David said with the ghost of a smile, "what's our next move?" Their strategy took shape over the following days, unfolding with the precision of a military operation. Earl's network expanded exponentially as each contact reached out to others, creating a web of support that stretched across multiple states. A contractor from Illinois who'd served with the 10th Mountain Division in a later deployment volunteered to oversee the structural repairs. A plumber whose son had lost a leg in Iraq drove 3 hours to replace David's entire water system for the cost of parts only. A roofing crew showed up on Saturday, materials donated by a supply company that Earl had once delivered to during a hurricane evacuation. Word spread through Millerville with the efficiency of small-town communication networks. By Sunday afternoon, a steady stream of locals began appearing at David's property, some bringing food, others offering labor, all of them somehow finding the courage to take a stand now that the first steps had been taken. Earl observed this. Transformation from the periphery, coordinating rather than commanding, guiding rather than directing. It was a role he'd perfected in the military, creating the conditions for success, and then letting those with the necessary skills execute the plan. James Sr.'s response came Monday morning, less than 24 hours before the town council meeting. Earl was helping unload electrical supplies when a black Lincoln Navigator pulled into David's driveway, coming to a stop with deliberate precision beside Earl's Peterbilt. The man who emerged was in his 60s, expensively dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in rural Millerville. His hair was silver at the temples, his face deeply tanned, his movements those of someone accustomed to deference. 2 younger men in similar suits flanked him as he approached, not Tyler, Earl noted, but professional associates with the anonymous look of corporate enforcers. "Earl Whitaker," James Sr. called, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "Been a long time. High school championship, 85. You were the tight end, if I recall correctly." Earl straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before extending one in a gesture that social convention would make difficult for James to ignore. "James, good memory." James shook his hand briefly, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I make it a point to remember details about people, useful in business." He glanced around at the activity on the property, the half-finished roof, the new wheelchair ramp being constructed to more modern specifications, the plumbing trenches still open along one side of the house. Quite an operation you've got. Going here, surprised a man with your background, would involve himself in local matters. The implied threat was subtle, but clear. James had looked into Earl's history and found something he thought could be leveraged. Earl remained impassive, waiting. "I'd like to speak with you privately," James continued, gesturing toward his vehicle. "A business proposition that might interest you." Earl considered the offer, aware that David had wheeled himself to the edge of the porch, watching the interaction with evident concern. "We can talk here," Earl said finally. "I'm in the middle of a delivery." Annoyance flickered across James's carefully composed features. "Very well. To be direct, Mr. Whitaker, I believe your talents are being wasted on this project." He waved dismissively at the ongoing repairs. "I have connections with several national transportation companies always looking for experienced owner-operators. Premium routes, guaranteed contracts, very attractive compensation packages. In exchange for what?" Earl asked, though he already knew the answer. James smiled thinly. "In exchange for you concluding your business in Millerville and returning to your regular routes immediately." Earl met his gaze steadily. "And if I decline? Then I'd be concerned about potential disruptions to your business. Trucking is heavily regulated, as you know. Permits, inspections, certifications, so many details to maintain." James straightened his already immaculate tie. "I'd hate to see a man of your unique history face unnecessary scrutiny." The threat was no longer implied, but explicit. Earl had known men like James before, those who viewed power as a weapon to be wielded rather than a responsibility to be carried. In Afghanistan, they'd been warlords controlling villages through fear. In America, they wore suits and used paperwork instead of weapons, but the principle was the same. "I appreciate the offer," Earl said, his voice even, "but I've already made commitments here." James's expression hardened. "Loyalty is admirable, Mr. Whitaker, but misplaced in this instance. David Reynolds is fighting a losing battle. This property will be rezoned tomorrow, regardless of your community project." He gestured toward the volunteers working around the property. "After that, eminent domain proceedings will begin. The county has already determined that a commercial development here serves the public interest by creating jobs." "Then why the offer?" Earl asked. "If it's such a sure thing." James studied him for a moment, reassessing. "Efficiency," he said finally. "Delay costs money. Your presence has encouraged a certain resistance. That's becoming inefficient to manage." From the porch, David called out, "Everything okay over there, Earl?" Earl nodded without taking his eyes off James, just catching up with an old acquaintance. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. "One last piece of friendly advice. Your military record includes some interesting details about your final mission. Details that might concern potential clients if they became public. Some might even view certain decisions you made as dishonorable." The word hit Earl like a physical blow, though he allowed no reaction to show. James couldn't possibly know the full truth of what had happened in that remote Afghan valley on Earl's final deployment, the mission that had left him scarred in more ways than just the marks on his body. The official report had been classified, the real story known only to those who had been there. "The town council meets tomorrow at 7, James continued, taking Earl's silence as evidence his threat had landed. "I expect this property to be cleared of all this." He waved a hand at the construction materials and volunteers. Activity by then. "Afterwards, we can discuss the details of those transportation contracts I mentioned." Without waiting for a response, James turned and walked back to his navigator, his corporate foot soldiers following in his wake. Earl watched them go, something cold and focused settling in his mind. Not anger. Exactly. But the clear, crystalline clarity he'd experienced in combat when all the noise and confusion fell away, leaving only the essential calculus of survival. David wheeled himself down the newly reinforced ramp, coming to a stop beside Earl as the navigator disappeared down the driveway. What was that about? Earl considered how much to share. James thinks he can buy me off. Wants me gone before the council meeting tomorrow. David's expression darkened. And when you said no, he threatened you. It wasn't a question. Earl nodded once. I'm sorry, Earl. This isn't your fight. Never was. David looked around at the property, at the half-completed repairs, at the volunteers who had paused in their work to watch the confrontation. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. Maybe it's time to... No, Earl said, a single word carrying the weight of decision. We finish what we started. As the day progressed, word of James's visit spread through the network of volunteers, adding a new urgency to their efforts. The roofing crew worked until dusk, finishing just as the light faded. The plumbers completed their connections and tested the system under pressure. The electricians ran new wiring to replace the dangerous knob and tube installation that dated from the 1940s. Throughout it all, Earl moved from task to task, coordinating, problem-solving, ensuring that every aspect of the work met or exceeded code requirements. By nightfall, the property had been transformed, not into something new or different, but into a better version of what it had always been. A modest home on land that had been loved and tended for generations. As the last of the volunteers departed, promises to return the next day trailing behind them, Earl sat with David on the porch, the evening air cool against their faces. Whatever happens tomorrow, David said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, thank you for everything. Earl nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant line of willows along the creek, where the last light of day still lingered. We're not done yet, he said softly, his mind already mapping out the final phase of their resistance. Morning arrived with an electrical storm that seemed fitting for the day ahead. Earl woke to the crash of thunder and the staccato drumming of rain against the window of his room above the hardware store. For a moment, disoriented between sleep and wakefulness, he was back in Afghanistan, the sounds transforming into artillery fire and the urgent rhythm of helicopter rotors. He shook off the memory and rose, moving through his morning routine with mechanical precision while his mind worked through contingencies for the day ahead. The town council meeting was 12 hours away. Much could happen in 12 hours. Harvey was already downstairs as usual, this time sorting through a shipment of flashlights and batteries, storm supplies for anxious customers. Power's out on the east side of town, Harvey said by way of greeting, including Creek Road. Earl paused in the act of pouring coffee. David, generator kicked in, Harvey assured him. That new one you had delivered last week. But there's been some flooding along the creek. Sheriff called it in about an hour ago. Earl nodded, finishing his coffee in 3 quick swallows. I'll head out there. Harvey handed him a plastic crate filled with additional batteries, waterproof tarps, and a battery-operated radio. Might need these. Roads are bad. Johnson's Creek Bridge is underwater. You'll have to take the long way around. The long way meant a 15-mile detour along county roads that wound through hills to the north, before looping back to approach Creek Road from the opposite direction. Earl loaded the supplies into his truck and set out, wipers struggling against the downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. He was halfway to David's when his phone rang. Sheriff Dawson, his voice barely audible over the static of the poor connection. At David's place, Dawson was saying, the words cutting in and out. Building inspector, immediate evacuation order. Say again, Earl shouted over the storm, pulling to the side of the road where a slight rise might improve reception. County building inspector, Dawson repeated, clearer now. Just showed up with an immediate evacuation order. Claims the creek flooding presents imminent danger. Got paperwork this time, signed by a judge I've never heard of from 3 counties over. Earl's grip tightened on the phone. David? Refusing to leave. I'm here, but officially I'm supposed to enforce the evacuation order. The conflict in Dawson's voice was evident. They're giving him 1 hour to vacate before they forcibly remove him. Stall them, Earl said, already putting the truck back in gear. I'm 20 minutes out. Earl, Dawson's voice took on a warning tone. They've got state police with them. This isn't just James Sr. pulling strings anymore. This is official. Stall. Them, Earl repeated, ending the call. He pushed the Peterbilt as hard as he dared on the rain-slicked roads, taking curves with a calculated recklessness that drew on years of experience navigating far worse conditions. His mind raced ahead, evaluating and discarding options with the rapid assessment of a combat veteran. Identifying threats and escape routes, James had escalated beyond local pressure tactics. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, a severe storm, power outages, flooding, and suddenly an emergency evacuation order from a judge 3 counties away. Someone had been planning this contingency, waiting for the right moment to execute. Earl rounded the final bend to David's property and immediately understood the full scope of the situation. The creek had indeed overflowed its banks, water coursing across the lower section of the property, but nowhere near the house itself, which sat on a rise well above the floodplain. 3 official vehicles were parked in the driveway: a county building department truck, a state police cruiser, and Sheriff Dawson's familiar SUV. On the porch, David sat in his wheelchair, facing off against a building inspector in a rain slicker and 2 state troopers. Dawson stood to one side, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture subtly aligned with David rather than the officials. Earl parked behind Dawson's vehicle and stepped out into the rain, which had tapered to a steady drizzle. All heads turned at his arrival, reactions ranging from David's relief to the building inspector's irritation. "Sir, this is an official evacuation," one of the troopers called as Earl approached. "The property has been deemed unsafe due to imminent flood. Danger." Earl ignored him, climbing the steps to stand beside David. He assessed the situation quickly, the paperwork clutched in the inspector's hand. The trooper's uncomfortable but determined stance, Dawson's carefully maintained neutrality that nonetheless communicated volumes about where his sympathies lay. "The house is on high ground," Earl said, addressing the inspector directly. "No flood danger." The inspector, a thin man with the pinched expression of someone executing unpleasant orders, shook his head. "The order isn't just about current flooding. It's about structural stability. The saturated soil could compromise the foundation." "We just replaced the foundation supports," Earl countered. "Full concrete footings to bedrock, certified by a structural engineer." He'd insisted on the foundation work first, recognizing it as a potential vulnerability both structurally and legally. The inspector faltered, clearly not expecting this level of specific pushback. I haven't seen those certifications." "They're on file with the county as of yesterday," Earl said, the statement truthful though deliberately misleading. The paperwork had been submitted late the previous evening, almost certainly not yet processed. The inspector glanced at the troopers, his certainty visibly wavering. "The evacuation order stands until those certifications are verified." "By whom?" Earl pressed. "The judge who signed this order is from Harrisville County. He has no jurisdiction here, unless this was filed through the State Emergency Management Office." Another detail gleaned from his lawyer contact, who had outlined precisely what would constitute a valid emergency evacuation order. The building inspector's expression confirmed Earl's suspicion. The paperwork, while official looking, had been rushed through irregular channels. James Sr. had connections, but even he couldn't completely circumvent proper legal procedures on such short notice. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, his professional demeanor firmly in place. Given the questions about jurisdiction and the fact that Mr. Reynolds has a certified accessible dwelling specifically modified for his disability, I suggest we postpone any evacuation until these matters can be properly resolved. He addressed the state troopers directly. I'll take full responsibility for monitoring the situation here. The troopers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the legal ambiguities. They had been called in to assist with what they'd been told was a routine emergency evacuation, not to navigate jurisdictional disputes or potentially violate a disabled veteran's rights. We'll need to call this in, the senior trooper finally said, stepping away to use his radio. The building inspector glared at Earl. This isn't over. The council meeting is still tonight. Yes, Earl agreed calmly. It is. The confrontation ended in an unsatisfying stalemate, the evacuation order temporarily suspended pending further review, the officials retreating with promises to return. As their vehicles pulled away, Dawson remained behind, shaking his head slowly. That was too close, he said quietly. And it's just the beginning. James isn't going to stop. David wheeled himself to the edge of the porch, looking out over his property where floodwaters were already beginning to recede as the storm moved eastward. He's desperate, David observed. Rushing things, making mistakes. Why? The council. Meeting is tonight. If he's so confident about the vote. He's not, Earl said, the pieces falling into place. At least, not anymore. Dawson nodded slowly. Margaret Whitley. She's the swing vote, and she's been asking questions about the environmental impact study, specifically about water table contamination from industrial use. He gestured toward the creek. This storm might have just given her all the evidence she needs to vote against rezoning. The realization settled over them. James's urgency suddenly made sense. He needed David's property empty, abandoned, before the council meeting. An uninhabitable designation would strengthen his case for rezoning regardless of environmental concerns. We need to get to that meeting, David said, anew, determination in his voice. All of us. Earl nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, caught on something James had said during their confrontation the day before. Your military record includes some interesting details about your final mission. It wasn't just a general threat. James had specific information, details that shouldn't have been accessible to a civilian real estate developer, no matter how well connected. Sheriff, Earl said, what do you know about James's background, beyond the construction business and real estate? Dawson frowned. Not much. He left Millerville after high school, came back about 15 years ago with money. Never said where it came from. He paused, considering. There were rumors he had government contracts at one point. Construction in the Middle East during the war. Why? Earl felt the last piece click into place, a cold certainty settling in his gut. I need to make a call, he said, already turning toward his truck where a locked box contained the one thing he'd kept from his final deployment evidence he'd never expected to use but couldn't bring himself to destroy, the mission that had ended his military career and left him scarred inside and out, might finally serve a purpose beyond nightmares and regret. The Millerville Town Hall was a modest brick building that dated from the 1930s, its architecture reflecting the solid, unembellished practicality of a community built on farming and small industry. Tonight, every parking space within 2 blocks was filled, forcing latecomers to leave their vehicles along side streets and walk through the lingering puddles from the afternoon storm. Earl arrived early, parking his Peterbilt a block away where he could observe the building's main entrance. He sat motionless behind the wheel, watching as Millerville's residents filed into the town hall. Some he recognized from Lou's Diner or Harvey's Hardware. Others were strangers, though he could often guess their allegiances from their expressions, or the people they arrived with. The locked metal box from his truck sat on the passenger seat beside him, its contents now organized in a manila folder. After his call, a tense 20-minute conversation with a former comrade now working at the Pentagon, Earl had spent the afternoon verifying what he'd long suspected but never confirmed: the connection between James Sr. and the tragedy that had ended his military career. A knock on his window startled him from his thoughts. Sheriff Dawson stood in the rain, his uniform covered by a department-issued slicker. Earl lowered the window. "Thought you might want to know," Dawson said without preamble. "James has his people handing out these flyers." He passed a glossy pamphlet through the window. "Professional job. Must have had them printed days ago." The flyer showcased an artist's rendering of Creek Road Commerce Center, a complex of modern buildings, nestled in landscaped grounds where David's house and the neighboring properties currently stood. Promised benefits included 200-plus new jobs and economic revitalization. At the bottom, in smaller print, pending town council approval. "They're calling it a done deal," Dawson continued. "Got people all excited about job interviews next month." Earl studied the image, noting how the rendering cleverly obscured the creek itself, reducing it to a decorative water feature rather than the living waterway that sustained the valley's ecosystem. "David inside already?" Dawson nodded. "Marlin brought him." "They're saving you a seat." He hesitated. "Whatever you're planning, Earl ... Just remember, there are rules." "I remember," Earl said, tucking the folder under his arm as he prepared to. "Exit the truck. Sometimes the rules protect the wrong people." The town hall's meeting room was filled beyond capacity, the crowd spilling into the hallway where speakers had been set up to allow those outside to hear the proceedings. Earl made his way through the press of bodies, conscious of the glances. That followed his progress, some curious, some hostile, others hopeful. News of the morning's confrontation at David's property had spread through town with predictable EMBELLISHMENTS. David and Marlin had claimed seats in the front row, directly facing the council's elevated dais, where 5 chairs waited behind. A curved wooden table. David nodded as Earl approached, gesturing to the empty seat they'd saved beside him. "Didn't think you'd make it," David said, his voice pitched low beneath the buzz of conversation filling the room. "Thought maybe James's threats had gotten to you after all." Earl shook his head slightly. Needed to confirm some facts. He placed the folder on his lap, keeping one hand rested on it, as if it might otherwise disappear. At precisely 7 o'clock, the side door opened and the town council members filed in, 4 men and 1 woman, all in their 50s or older, their expressions ranging from resigned to determined. Mayor Hopkins, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and the perpetually harried look of someone juggling too many responsibilities, took the center chair and called the meeting to order, with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice amplified by the microphone in front of him, "thank you for attending tonight's special session of the Millerville Town Council. We have a single agenda item: the proposed rezoning of the Creek Road Agricultural District to commercial industrial use." A murmur ran through the crowd, quickly silenced by another rap of the gavel. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this is an official proceeding. We will maintain order and respect. Each side will have an opportunity to present their case, followed by public comments limited to 3 minutes per speaker." Mayor Hopkins shuffled his papers, then continued. "First, we'll hear from the applicant, Millerville Development Corporation, represented by Mr. James Harmon Sr. James rose from his seat in the second row, buttoning his tailored suit jacket as he approached the podium. He looked every inch the successful businessman, confident, authoritative, a man accustomed to getting his way through charm when possible and force when necessary. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members, friends and neighbors," James began, his voice warm with practiced sincerity. "I stand before you tonight, not just as a businessman, but as a son of Millerville. Though I left for a time to build my company, my heart remained here, in the town where I grew up, played football, fell. In love?" Earl watched the performance with detached interest, noting the calculated pauses, the strategic eye contact with council members, the rehearsed gestures that conveyed both confidence and humility. James was good better than Earl had expected. "The proposal before you tonight represents more than just a zoning change," James continued. "It represents Millerville's future. Since the closure of the manufacturing plant, our town has been struggling. Jobs lost, young people leaving, businesses closing." He gestured toward the audience. "Look around. How many of you have children? Or grandchildren who've had to move away to find work?" The question resonated, heads nodding throughout the room. James pressed his advantage. "The Creek Road Commerce Center will bring over 200 jobs to Millerville. Not minimum wage jobs, good jobs with benefits. Technology jobs, manufacturing jobs. Jobs that can support families, buy homes, rebuild our tax base to fund schools. And services." For the next 20 minutes, James outlined his vision with the aid of professional slides and video, painting a picture of prosperity and renewal that seemed both tantalizing and inevitable. He addressed potential concerns before they could be raised. Traffic would be minimized by a new access road. Environmental impacts would be mitigated by state-of-the-art filtration systems. Historical considerations would be honored through architectural elements that paid homage to Millerville's agricultural heritage. As James concluded to polite applause, Earl glanced at David, whose face had settled into a mask of contained anger. Beside him, Marlene clutched her brother's hand, her knuckles white. "Thank you, Mr. Harmon," Mayor Hopkins said. "Now, we'll hear from those opposing the rezoning application." David wheeled himself forward, positioning his chair in the space beside the podium. He looked small in the large room, his wheelchair emphasizing his physical vulnerability. But when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had faced far worse than a town council meeting. "My name is David Reynolds. My family has lived on Creek Road for 4 generations. That land you're talking about rezoning isn't just property to me. It's home." He paused, letting the words settle. "Mr. Harmon talks about Millerville's future. I want to talk about its past and the promises we make to each other as neighbors." David spoke without notes, his words unpolished, but powerful. He talked about his grandfather teaching him to fish in the creek that ran through their property, about his father working that land while holding down a second job at the factory to make ends meet, about his own service in Iraq and his return to a hometown that had supported him through recovery and rehabilitation. "I'm not against progress," David continued. "But progress doesn't have to come at the cost of erasing what makes this place special. Once that creek is paved over and those trees are cut down, they're gone forever. Once those homes are bulldozed, the families who've lived there for generations will be scattered." As David spoke, Earl observed the council members, particularly Margaret Whitley, the former schoolteacher whose vote would likely decide the outcome. She listened intently, her expression thoughtful but guarded. Beside her, the other council members showed varying degrees of engagement. 2 checked their watches repeatedly, clearly having already decided. Another took detailed notes. The 4th stared at his folded hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. After David finished, several other residents spoke, some supporting his position, others favoring development. The meeting followed the predictable rhythm of small-town governance, with passionate speeches, occasional outbursts quickly silenced by the mayor's gavel, and the slow tick of the clock on the wall, marking the passage of time. Earl sat quietly through it all, the folder unopened on his lap. He was waiting for the right moment, watching James Sr., who maintained a composed expression throughout the opposing testimony, occasionally leaning over to whisper to the expensively dressed woman beside him, his lawyer, judging by the legal pad she continuously annotated. Finally, with public comments concluded, Mayor Hopkins turned to the council. Before we move to deliberation and vote, does anyone else wish to address the council on this matter? Earl stood. A ripple of whispers moved through the room as he walked to the podium, the folder now in his hand. Most of Millerville knew him only as the trucker who'd been helping David Reynolds, a mysterious outsider who'd somehow inserted himself into local affairs. James Sr.'s expression remained neutral, but his posture stiffened slightly, the only visible sign of his awareness that the situation had suddenly veered from his carefully orchestrated plan. "My name is Earl Whitaker," he began, his voice carrying easily without the microphone. Years of issuing orders in combat zones had taught him how to project authority through sound alone. "I'm not a Millerville resident, just a trucker who's been passing through for years." He paused. But sometimes an outsider sees things locals miss. Earl opened the folder, removing a single sheet of paper. "This isn't about zoning or jobs or progress. It's about something that happened 11 years ago, half a world away, in a valley in Afghanistan." The non sequitur caused confusion, people exchanging puzzled glances. Mayor Hopkins leaned forward. "Mr. Whitaker, is this relevant to the rezoning application?" "Yes," Earl said simply, because the man applying for this rezoning, James Harmon Sr., was the CEO of Harmon Global Logistics, a military contractor that supplied equipment to forward operating bases in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2014. James rose from his seat. "Mr. Mayor, this is completely irrelevant and potentially defamatory." "I must object." Mayor Hopkins looked uncertain. "Mr. Whitaker, please keep your comments focused on the matter at hand." "This is the matter at hand," Earl continued, unperturbed. "In 2013, my unit was deployed to the Kunar province. We were using buildings constructed by Harmon Global Logistics buildings that were supposed to be built to military specifications for operations in hostile territory." The room had fallen completely silent now, the unexpected turn holding everyone's attention. Earl continued, his voice steady. "During a Taliban attack, the roof supports failed. 5 of my men died, not from enemy fire, but because Harmon Global had substituted substandard materials while charging the government for military-grade components." Earl placed the paper on the podium, a redacted but still legible page from an Inspector General's report. An investigation was conducted, settlements were paid, records were sealed, and James Harmon quietly sold his company, changed its name, and moved home to Millerville with millions in profits. James was on his feet again. "This is slander. Whatever happened in Afghanistan had nothing to do with me personally. Corporate liability is not personal liability." Earl turned to face him directly. "You signed the work orders. You approved the material substitutions. You knew those buildings wouldn't withstand a direct hit, but you certified them anyway." "You can't prove that," James snapped, his composed facade cracking. "Actually, I can." Earl removed another document from the folder. "This is a copy of a memorandum you sent to your site managers, instructing them to use local materials instead of the specified reinforced components. You wrote, and I quote, 'The likelihood of direct impact is minimal. The cost savings outweigh the minimal additional risk.'" He looked up. 5 men died weighing that risk. A council chamber erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Mayor Hopkins banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. James's lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, but he shook her off, his face flushed with anger or fear or both. "What does any of this have to do with rezoning?" he demanded. "This is ancient history, and it has no bearing on the development project." Earl turned back to the council. "It has everything to do with it. The same man who cut corners on military buildings, knowing soldiers' lives were at stake, now wants you to trust him with Millerville's future. The same man who falsified documentation to the federal government now presents you with environmental impact studies that he paid for." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "And the same man who quietly buried his responsibility for 5 deaths now wants to bury a creek that sustained this community for generations." Margaret Whitley, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. "Mr. Mayor, I'd like to ask Mr. Whitaker a question, if I may." Mayor Hopkins nodded, clearly relieved to return to something resembling protocol. "Mr. Whitaker," Margaret began, her voice that of a teacher accustomed to cutting through noise, "you said you've been passing through Millerville for years. Why involve yourself in this matter? What stake do you have in our town's decision?" It was the question Earl had been expecting, the one he'd asked himself repeatedly over the past week. His answer came not from the careful calculations of strategy, but from somewhere deeper. "Because sometimes passing through isn't enough," he said finally. "Sometimes you have to stop and stand for something." The simplicity of the answer seemed to resonate with Margaret, who nodded slowly before turning her attention to James. "Mr. Harmon, would you care to respond to these allegations?" James had regained some of his composure, his lawyer now standing beside him with a supportive hand on his arm. "These are serious allegations that would need to be addressed in a proper legal venue, not a town council meeting. For now, I will simply say that Mr. Whitaker's characterization of events is disputed, and his motives for bringing this up now, in this forum, should be questioned." He turned to address the council directly. "The rezoning application before you is about Millerville's future, not my past. The jobs and economic benefits this development will bring are real, regardless of Mr. Whitaker's personal vendetta." The room had divided itself visibly now. Those who supported James clustered on one side, those aligned with David Reynolds on the other. But there was a larger middle group, residents who had come expecting a routine rezoning debate and now found themselves witnesses to something far more complex. Mayor Hopkins attempted to regain control of the meeting. "I think we should proceed to council deliberation," he began, but was interrupted by the back doors of the chamber swinging open. "Tyler." James entered, his face flushed from exertion or emotion, his expensive clothes soaked with rain. He scanned the room until he located his father, then marched down the center aisle with determined strides. "Tyler," James hissed as his son approached. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Tyler said, his voice carrying in the suddenly. "Quiet room. Dad, they're at Reynolds' place right now. Your contractors. They're setting fire to the house." A collective gasp rose from the audience. David half rose from his wheelchair, restrained only by Marlene's hand on his arm. "What are you talking about?" James demanded, but his face had gone pale. The reaction of a man hearing that a contingency plan he'd authorized, but didn't want to know the details of, was now being executed. Tyler turned to face the council and the crowd. "My father hired men to burn down David Reynolds' house during this meeting, to make it look like an accident electrical fire from the storm damage." His voice cracked. "I heard him on the phone. He said to make sure no one was there, but to make sure nothing was left." Sheriff Dawson was already moving toward the exit, radio in hand, calling for all available units. Earl caught his eye as he passed, a silent communication passing between them. "Council is adjourned," Mayor Hopkins announced, but no one was listening anymore. The room had erupted into chaos, people rushing for the doors, some to help, others simply to witness. Outside, The night sky to the east glowed with an ominous orange light, visible even through the lingering rain, the unmistakable signature of a structure fire. Earl pushed through the crowd to his truck. David and Marlene close behind. "I'm coming with you," David insisted as Earl helped him into the passenger seat of the Peterbilt. "So am I," Marlene added, climbing up behind them. Earl didn't argue, firing up the diesel engine and pulling away from the curb with a roar that scattered the onlookers. As they raced toward Creek Road, he glanced in his rearview mirror to see a procession of vehicles following Sheriff Dawson's cruiser, Harvey's pickup, and dozens of others, a community mobilized by crisis and something more powerful, the recognition of a line that couldn't be UNCROSSE, D. The confrontation that had begun with mockery in a diner and escalated through threats and legal maneuvers was now racing toward its final resolution. As Earl pushed the truck to its limits, he felt a strange calm descend, the familiar clarity of purpose that came with knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the skills to do it. Whatever waited for them at the end of Creek Road, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was no longer just passing through. 6 months later, Earl sat on David's newly rebuilt porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands against the autumn chill. The creek below the property burbled quietly, its waters clear and unhurried beneath a canopy of trees blazing with fall colors red. Maples, golden oaks, the occasional flash of purple ash dot. The house behind him was not the same structure that had stood on this foundation for generations. That house had been lost in the fire, despite the best efforts of the impromptu brigade that had formed from the town council meeting. But what rose in its place carried the spirit of the original, a simple, sturdy home designed for David's needs, but built with the future in mind. Wide doorways, accessible counters, a covered ramp that blended seamlessly with the wraparound. Porch all constructed with the precision and care of people building something meant to last. "Paper says they're sentencing James next week," David said, wheeling himself through the front door to join Earl. He held out a folded newspaper, the Millerville Gazette's headline clearly visible. "Harmon faces up to 5 years in federal case." Earl nodded, not reaching for the paper. He'd followed the case from a distance, providing testimony when required, but otherwise letting the justice system do its work. The charges against James Sr. had multiplied once the initial investigation began. The arson attempt had led to insurance fraud charges, which uncovered tax irregularities, which in turn revealed a pattern of bribery involving county officials. The military contract violations that Earl had exposed became just one count in a lengthy indictment. Tyler testified against him, David continued, setting the paper on the small table between them. "Kid's trying to make amends in his own way." "And the development?" Earl asked, though he already knew the answer. The fate of the Creek Road property had been settled months ago, but he found himself asking for reassurance, a habit formed during years when certainty was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Land Trust took ownership last week," David said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Conservation easements in place. Creek and surrounding acres will stay undeveloped, open to the public. For recreation." Margaret Whitley's heading the board of directors. The transformation of Millerville and the aftermath of that rainy night had been remarkable to witness. The scandal surrounding James Sr. had initially threatened to tear the community apart, revealing divisions deeper than anyone had acknowledged. But something unexpected had emerged from the chaos, a renewed sense of shared purpose, a recognition that the town's future didn't have to come at the expense of its past. The jobs James had promised materialized anyway, though in a different form. A technology company looking to escape the high costs of urban headquarters had purchased the old manufacturing plant, renovating the existing structure rather than building new. The tax incentives originally earmarked for James's development had been redirected to fund a small business incubator in the downtown storefronts that had stood empty for years. Through it all, Earl had remained, first living in his room above the hardware store, then eventually purchasing a small house at the edge of town close enough to be part of the community, but with enough space around it to satisfy his need for solitude. His trucking business had evolved as well, shifting from long-haul routes to regional deliveries that allowed him to be home most nights. "Got a call from Marlene this morning," David said, interrupting Earl's thoughts. "Lou's retiring, selling the diner." Earl raised an eyebrow, surprised. Lou was an institution in Millerville, though few people had actually seen the man in recent years. He ran the diner from afar, trusting Marlene to manage day-to-day operations. "Marlene's buying it," David continued, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Said she's changing the name to Marlene's. Asked if he'd be interested in investing. Something about expanding the back room, adding a lounge area for truckers passing through." Earl considered the proposition, mentally calculating figures his savings, the steady income from his revised business model, the potential return on such an investment. But the numbers felt secondary to the deeper implication of Marlene's offer. A permanent stake in Millerville, a commitment beyond just residing there. "Might be," he said finally, the non-committal response belied by the thoughtful consideration. In his eyes, David nodded, understanding what remained unsaid. In the months since the fire, he and Earl had developed a communication style that required few words, a shorthand born of shared experience and mutual respect. "Sheriff Dawson's running for mayor," David added after a comfortable silence. "Harvey's managing his campaign. Says it's time for someone who remembers what Millerville stands for, but isn't afraid of sensible change." The conversation drifted into other topics. The veteran support group that now met weekly in the community center, the plans for expanding, the hardware store to include a cafe, the high school football team's surprising run at the state championship, the rhythm of small-town life, with its intricate web of connections and its steady pulse of seasons and celebrations. As afternoon faded toward evening, David went inside to start dinner, a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally, Earl bringing fresh produce from his garden, David cooking with the skills he'd developed during his rehabilitation. The sound of chopping and the aroma of sauteing onions drifted through the open door as Earl remained on the porch, watching the light change over the creek. A movement at the edge of the property caught his attention, a young deer emerging cautiously from the trees, testing the air before venturing further into the open. It paused at the garden's edge, considering the late-season kale before apparently deciding against it and continuing toward the creek. Two more followed, a doe and another fawn, their movements relaxed in the safety of protected land. Earl watched them without moving, appreciating the privilege of witnessing something so ordinary, yet profound life continuing, undisturbed by human drama, indifferent to the battles fought over this piece of earth. The deer moved with the quiet confidence of creatures at home in their environment, secure in the ancient knowledge of their place in the world. As dusk settled over the valley, Earl finally rose, stretching muscles that had grown stiff with sitting. He gathered the coffee cups and newspaper, preparing to join David inside. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at the property spread before him, the land that had become, unexpectedly, the place where his long journey had found, if not an ending, then at least a pause, a resting place. The scars beneath his jacket would always remain, physical reminders of wounds that had healed but never vanished completely. So too would the less visible scars, the memories of Afghanistan, the weight of decisions made in moments when there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. But here, in this quiet corner of a small town he'd once only passed through, Earl had found something he hadn't known he was seeking. Not redemption, exactly, but purpose, connection. belonging. He unzipped his jacket in the warmth of the house, no longer conscious of the gesture that had once seemed so momentous in Lou's diner. The scars were still there, but they had become simply another part of who he was. Not a revelation, not a secret, just one chapter in a longer story. "Hey," David called from the kitchen. "Come taste this sauce and tell me if it needs more garlic." Earl zipped his jacket back up against the evening chill and stepped inside, closing the door on the gathering darkness, moving toward the light and warmth and the future that waited there.